Somewhere in the world tonight, the wind moves across an ancient plain. The grass bends. The stars above are the same stars that watched over empires you were never taught about in school. Great cities. Libraries full of knowledge. Mathematicians and astronomers and architects who looked at the sky the same way you are perhaps looking at the ceiling right now. This is not a story about a forgotten continent. It is a story about how some of the most extraordinary human achievements in history were simply misplaced for a while. And about how they are still there, waiting quietly beneath the ground and behind the stone walls and between the lines of very old manuscripts, for anyone patient enough to look. Tonight, you are going to drift through them. Through kingdoms that controlled more gold than any other place on earth. Through cities that were home to universities when much of Europe was still building its first stone churches. Through civilizations that traded across oceans, mapped the stars, and built monuments that still stand after 2,000 years. Let your body become comfortable. Let your shoulders settle. Let the breath come and go without any particular effort. You do not need to remember everything you are about to hear. You only need to let it drift through you, like warm air through an open window on a quiet evening. Africa is the oldest inhabited continent on Earth. Human beings have lived there for longer than anywhere else, longer than Europe, longer than Asia, longer than the Americas. The first stone tools were made there. The first controlled use of fire. The first cave paintings. The first evidence of abstract thought, of human beings looking at the world and deciding to represent it, to symbolize it, to make something that meant more than its materials. And yet the empires and kingdoms and civilizations that arose from this ancient soil are among the least known in the popular imagination. The names of their rulers are rarely taught in schools outside the continent. Their architectural achievements are rarely placed beside those of Rome or Greece or China in the textbooks that shape how most people understand the ancient world. Tonight, this changes slightly. Not dramatically. Not with the force of a lecture or an argument. But gently, in the way that knowledge enters when you are relaxed and open and drifting towards sleep. The kind of knowing that settles into you quietly, and is still there when you wake. We will travel across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. We will visit a kingdom that existed for 3,000 years along the banks of a great river. We will walk through a city of stone buildings in the heart of the continent, assembled without mortar, without cranes, without anything except human patience and intelligence. We will stand in a library where the books were made of gold dust and paper and contained the knowledge of the medieval world. We will trace trade routes that connected the African interior to the Persian Gulf, to China, to the courts of medieval Europe, along paths of exchange so ancient and so well-worn that they had been in use for centuries before most European states existed. All of this was real. All of it happened. And all of it is waiting for you, in the quiet dark, tonight. Kush and Nubia, the kingdom that outlasted Egypt. Begin with the river. The Nile is the longest river in the world. It flows northward for over 6,000 kilometers, from the highlands of East Africa to the delta where it meets the Mediterranean Sea. For most of recorded history, when people in the Western tradition thought about the Nile, they thought about Egypt, about the delta, about the pyramids at Giza, about the temples at Luxor and Karnak. But the Nile does not begin in Egypt. It flows through Egypt. And to the south, upstream, in the direction the Nile calls home, there existed a civilization every bit as ancient, every bit as sophisticated, and in some ways far more durable than the Egypt that overshadows it in the popular imagination. That civilization was called Kush. It was also called Nubia. Its people called themselves, in their own language, by names that scholars are still working to fully translate. But what we can say with confidence is this: the kingdom of Kush was among the oldest continuously inhabited political entities in human history. It endured, in one form or another, for approximately 3,000 years. 3,000 years. Let that number settle for a moment. The distance from ancient Kush to the present is roughly the same as the distance from ancient Kush back to the very beginnings of settled human civilization. The kingdom was already old when Rome was young. It was already ancient when the first stones of the Colosseum were being laid. The heartland of Kush lay along the Nile between what is now southern Egypt and central Sudan. The land was different from the Egypt to the north, less open, more rugged, the river cutting through gorges and cataracts rather than spreading across flat floodplains. The rainfall was slightly more generous. The soil of certain areas was extraordinarily fertile. And beneath the ground, in quantities that no other region of the ancient world could match, there was gold. The ancient Egyptians called this land Ta-Seti, meaning the land of the bow, acknowledging the extraordinary skill of Nubian archers. They also called it Ta-Nehesi, which scholars translate as the land of the black people. The ancient Egyptians traded with Kush, warred with Kush, employed Kushite soldiers, and occasionally feared Kush with a respect they rarely accorded to their southern neighbors. Because Kush could do something that very few other powers in the ancient world could do. It could challenge Egypt. And on at least one extraordinary occasion, it did more than challenge Egypt. It conquered it. Around 747 BCE, a Kushite king named Pi, sometimes called Pianki, led his armies northward from the capital city of Napata and swept through Upper Egypt with a speed and organization that the divided Egyptian principalities of the period could not resist. Within a few years, Pi and his successors had taken control of all of Egypt, from the Nile Delta to the heart of the Sudan. The Kushite rulers of this period are known to Egyptologists as the 25th dynasty of Egypt. They ruled one of the largest and most powerful states in the ancient world for approximately 70 years. These Kushite pharaohs were not pretenders or impostors borrowing Egyptian culture. They were deeply knowledgeable about Egyptian religion, art, and administration, in some cases more traditionally Egyptian in their practices than the Egyptian rulers they replaced. They restored temples. They revived ancient religious ceremonies that had fallen into neglect. They built in the Egyptian style and wrote in hieroglyphs and worshipped Egyptian gods. And they also brought with them their own distinctly Kushite traditions, most visibly in the shape of the pyramids they built. Kushite pyramids are among the most striking structures in the ancient world. They are steeper than their Egyptian predecessors, narrower at the base, rising more sharply toward the sky. There are more of them. Sudan today has more ancient pyramids than Egypt, over 250, clustered at sites called Meroe and Nuri and Jebel Barkal across the central and northern Sudanese landscape. They are smaller than the Great Pyramids of Giza. But their number, their preservation, and the sheer audacity of building them across a span of over 1,000 years speaks to something extraordinary about the civilization that made them. The city of Meroe became the capital of Kush around 300 BCE, after the power of the kingdom shifted southward. Meroe was not a small administrative settlement. It was a major city by any ancient standard, a center of iron production so significant that scholars sometimes call it the Birmingham of the ancient world. Iron smelting at Meroe produced tools, weapons, and agricultural implements that supported the kingdom's economy and enabled its long survival. The slag heaps from the ancient furnaces are still visible near the site today. Kush had its own writing system, a script called Meroitic, developed around 300 BCE, which remains only partially understood today. Scholars can pronounce the words, the letters have been deciphered, but the language beneath the letters has not yet been fully translated. The texts on temple walls and grave markers and everyday objects speak in a voice that humanity has not yet fully learned to hear again. The kingdom finally declined and fragmented in the 4th century CE, after more than 3,000 years. The city of Meroe was abandoned slowly, its pyramids remaining as the most enduring statement of its long existence. The civilization of Kush became, over the following centuries, one of the least studied major civilizations of the ancient world, overshadowed by the Egyptian culture it had both influenced and been influenced by, overlooked in the general Western understanding of African history. It is still there, in the desert of northern Sudan. The pyramids are still standing. The iron slag is still in the ground. The untranslated writing is still on the temple walls, waiting. Carthage, the empire Rome was afraid of. Turn now toward the north. Toward the coast where the African continent meets the Mediterranean Sea, in the place we now call Tunisia. Here, around 814 BCE, Phoenician settlers from the coast of what is now Lebanon established a colony they called Carthage. The Greeks would call it Carchedon. The Romans would call it Carthago. We call it Carthage. And Carthage became something its founders could scarcely have imagined. It became the dominant maritime power of the Western Mediterranean. It became the center of a trading empire that extended from the coast of Morocco to Sardinia to Sicily to Spain. It became, for several centuries, the most powerful city in the Western world. And it became the greatest rival the Roman Republic ever faced, the adversary that came closer than any other force to ending Rome before Rome had fully begun. At the height of its power, Carthage controlled a network of colonies and trading posts that stretched across the entire Western Mediterranean basin. Carthaginian ships were the finest in the ancient world, fast, well-built, crewed by experienced sailors who had mastered the currents and winds of the Mediterranean over generations. Carthaginian merchants traded in purple dye, tin, silver, gold, ivory, and slaves. Carthaginian engineers built harbors whose design influenced port construction for centuries. Carthaginian explorers sailed beyond the limits of the known world, down the Atlantic coast of Africa and possibly as far as sub-Saharan West Africa, and north to the British Isles. A Carthaginian admiral named Hanno, known as Hanno the Navigator, sailed south along the Atlantic coast of Africa sometime around 500 BCE. His account of the voyage survives in a Greek translation. He describes islands, rivers, forests of extraordinary size, and at one point a burning mountain, almost certainly Mount Cameroon, the only active volcano on the West African coast, which the crew watched in terrified awe from the water. He also describes encounters with people he calls the gorillae, possibly chimpanzees or gorillas, making this the first written account of great apes from a non-African tradition. It is the record of an African-based civilization exploring further into Africa, reaching places that no European sailor would reach for nearly 2,000 years. The relationship between Carthage and Rome is one of the defining geopolitical conflicts of the ancient world. They fought three major wars, the Punic Wars, from the Latin name for Phoenicians, between 264 and 146 BCE. The Second Punic War brought to the world a military commander of such genius that his name became a reference point for strategic brilliance for the next 2 millennia. His name was Hannibal Barca. He was born in Carthage around 247 BCE, the son of a general. According to a story he himself apparently told in later life, he asked his father at the age of 9 to be taken on campaign. His father agreed, on the condition that Hannibal swear an oath of perpetual enmity against Rome. Whether the story is literally true is debated. What is not debated is that Hannibal spent essentially his entire adult life in a state of war with the Roman Republic, and that he came, on more than one occasion, genuinely close to ending it. In 218 BCE, Hannibal assembled an army in Spain, marched it eastward across southern France, and crossed the Alps. In winter. With elephants. The crossing is still considered one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. He lost a significant portion of his army to the cold and the terrain. He entered Italy with what remained and proceeded to defeat every Roman army sent against him for the next 15 years. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal's forces encircled and destroyed a Roman army of approximately 70,000 men. It is considered by military historians to be one of the most complete tactical victories in recorded history. The Roman Senate met afterwards in a state of shock so profound that there are accounts of senators sitting in silence for minutes before anyone spoke. The battle gave military theory the concept of the double envelopment, the flanking maneuver that surrounds an enemy entirely, which armies have studied and attempted to replicate ever since. And yet Hannibal did not take Rome. He remained in Italy for more than a decade, fighting, winning, slowly wearing down the Roman alliance. But Rome rebuilt its armies, adapted its tactics, and eventually brought the war back to Africa. A Roman general named Scipio, who had studied Hannibal's own tactics and used them against him, defeated the Carthaginian army at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Hannibal survived the battle and lived for more than 20 additional years in various courts around the Mediterranean, advising kings and generals, before taking poison to avoid capture at approximately 65 years of age. Carthage itself was eventually destroyed in 146 BCE, at the end of the Third Punic War. The Roman Senate had been demanding its destruction for years. The phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, is attributed to Cato the Elder, who reportedly ended every speech in the Senate with it regardless of the topic under discussion. The city was taken, its buildings demolished, its remaining population killed or enslaved. The story that the Romans salted the earth of Carthage to prevent anything from growing there again is probably not literally true, but it captures something real about the thoroughness of the destruction. A great African city. A culture of extraordinary sophistication. A civilization that explored the Atlantic coast of Africa 1,500 years before European sailors. Gone. Remembered primarily through the accounts of the enemies who destroyed it. The ruins of Carthage are still there, on the outskirts of modern Tunis. You can walk through them on a warm afternoon and look at the harbor basins the Carthaginian engineers built, still visible in the shallow water. You can read the inscriptions that survived the Roman destruction. You can stand on the hill called the Bursa and look out over the Mediterranean and understand, in a way no textbook entirely conveys, how this place, facing the sea, for so long faced the world without flinching. The Kingdom of Aksum, Africa's Christian empire. Move now to the east. To the high plateau of the Horn of Africa, where the land rises above the heat of the lowlands into a cooler, clearer air. Here, in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, a kingdom arose in the early centuries of the Common Era that became one of the most powerful states in the ancient world. It was called Aksum. And at the height of its power, roughly between the 3rd and 7th century CE, the Roman writer Mani listed it alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 greatest empires on earth. This was not flattery. It was a geopolitical assessment. Aksum sat at a strategic crossing point between the Red Sea trade routes and the African interior. Its merchants traded in ivory, gold, frankincense, myrrh, slaves, and exotic animals. Its navy controlled significant portions of Red Sea commerce. Its rulers struck coins, gold, silver, and bronze, that circulated across the ancient world, from the Mediterranean to India. Aksumite coins have been found in archaeological excavations in India, Arabia, and across the Byzantine world. The architecture of Aksum was unlike anything else in the ancient world. The kingdom's rulers built enormous stone obelisks, called stelae, that rose from the earth like the fingers of giants. The largest, the stele of Aksum, stands approximately 24 meters tall and is carved from a single piece of granite. It was quarried, transported, and erected without wheels, without cranes, without any of the technologies we associate with large-scale construction. The engineering required to move and raise a single granite slab of that mass, in that terrain, remains a subject of active scholarly study. Around 330 CE, Aksum became one of the first states in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion. This happened when the king Ezana was converted by a Syrian scholar named Frumentius, who had come to Aksum as part of a trading delegation and remained. The conversion was genuine and profound. Aksumite coinage before Ezana's reign bore symbols of the sun and moon. After conversion, it bore the cross. The Christian church that took root in Aksum became the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian communities in continuous existence anywhere in the world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still celebrates liturgy in Guizi, the ancient language of Aksum, making it one of the very few living religious traditions that uses the direct spoken language of an ancient African kingdom in its worship today. Aksum also maintained a tradition that connects it, in Ethiopian belief and in a significant body of scholarly discussion, to one of the most resonant objects in the religious history of the Abrahamic faiths. The Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest described in the Hebrew Bible as the container of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, is claimed by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to have been brought to Aksum by Menelik, the son of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Ark has been in the care of the church at Aksum for nearly 3,000 years, housed in a small chapel called the Chapel of the Tablet beside the Cathedral of Our Lady Mary of Zion. It is guarded by a single monk, the keeper of the Ark, who is appointed for life and may never leave the chapel grounds. No outsider has been permitted to see the object in modern times. Whether the claim is historically true is a question that cannot currently be answered. But the tradition itself, the ancient kingdom, the sacred guardian, the chapel in the high plateau, is one of the most atmospheric facts in all of human religious history. Aksum declined after the 7th century CE, as the rise of Islam transformed the trade routes of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean and reshaped the geopolitical landscape around it. The kingdom retreated from its maritime position and became more inward-focused. The great trading empire faded. But the culture, the church, the ancient language, and the remarkable stele remained. In 2005, one of the great Aksumite obelisks was returned to Ethiopia. It had been taken to Rome in 1937 by the Italian military during the occupation of Ethiopia, and had stood outside the building of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome for decades. The return of the obelisk was treated in Ethiopia as a national event of profound cultural significance. The stone pillar raised by hands that have been still for 1,700 years, crossing the Mediterranean once more, coming home to the plateau where the air is thin and clear. Great Zimbabwe, the city without mortar. Move south now. Deep into the interior of the continent, to the high plateau between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers. A place of grassland and granite outcrops, warm days and cool nights. Here, between roughly the 9th and 15th century CE, an extraordinary city rose from the landscape. The people who built it used no mortar. The walls of their great enclosures were constructed from granite blocks, split and shaped and laid with such precision that they have held together for nearly 1,000 years through the simple force of their own weight and the skill of the hands that placed them. This city is called Great Zimbabwe. The name comes from the Shona language, Zimba Dzamabwe, meaning houses of stone. And the name is exactly right. Great Zimbabwe is a city of stone buildings, rising from a granite landscape, built by a civilization that understood stone with an intimacy and intelligence that produced something without parallel in sub-Saharan Africa. The site covers approximately 720 hectares. At its height, it may have been home to between 11,000 and 18,000 people, making it one of the largest cities anywhere in the southern hemisphere in the medieval period. The central enclosure, called the Great Enclosure, is surrounded by a wall that at its highest point reaches 11 meters and extends for more than 250 meters in circumference. The wall was built in 2 phases, using slightly different construction techniques, suggesting that the builders refined their methods over time, that the city was not simply built, but evolved, improved, was returned to and rethought across generations. Inside the great enclosure stands a conical tower, approximately 9 meters tall, whose purpose is still debated by archaeologists. It is solid, it has no interior, no entrance, no practical function that can currently be identified. The best hypothesis is that it was a symbolic structure, a representation of a royal granary, perhaps, or of the permanence of the state, or simply of the power of the ruler to direct human labor toward a purpose whose value was not purely practical. The same question could be asked of the pyramids of Egypt or the great cathedrals of Europe, and the same answer suggests itself. The will to build something permanent, something beyond function, is one of the most distinctly human impulses there is. The economy of Great Zimbabwe was built on cattle, farming, and trade. The surrounding plateau was exceptionally good cattle country, and the rulers of Great Zimbabwe accumulated enormous herds over centuries. But the city also controlled the gold trade routes that connected the interior of southern Africa to the coast of the Indian Ocean. Gold mined in the region was traded northward and eastward to the Swahili coast, where it entered the great Indian Ocean trading system and found its way to Arabia, India, Persia, and China. The evidence of this trade is visible in the objects found in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. Chinese Celadon pottery, Persian glass beads, Arab coins, a small bronze figurine from India. All of these objects, found in a stone city in the interior of southern Africa, testify to a civilization that was not isolated, not primitive, not cut off from the wider world. It was a participant in the most sophisticated long-distance trading network of the medieval age. The history of how Great Zimbabwe was misunderstood by European colonists after its rediscovery in the 19th century is, in itself, a significant story. When European explorers first encountered the ruins in the 1860s and 1870s, many of them refused to believe that the people who currently lived in the region, the Shona, could have built them. They proposed that the city had been built by ancient Phoenicians, or by the Queen of Sheba, or by Arabs, or by any number of external actors, anything, apparently, except the obvious conclusion that the ancestors of the people living around the ruins had built them. This willful misidentification was not merely an intellectual error. It was a deliberate political act, used to justify the colonial dispossession of the land on the grounds that its indigenous population had no genuine historical claim to it. The evidence was clear from a very early date that Great Zimbabwe was built by ancestors of the Shona people. The archaeological record was unambiguous. But the misidentification persisted in official colonial history for decades. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a source of deep national pride for the country that took its name from it. The city is still there. The walls still stand, the stones still fitted together without mortar, still held by nothing except precision and weight and the care of the hands that placed them 900 years ago. The Mali Empire, the richest person who ever lived. Travel north and west now, to the great bend of the Niger River, where the river curves through the Sahel and the savanna opens into grassland and the grassland fades toward desert. Here, in the region we now call Mali and Guinea and Senegal and Mauritania, there arose in the 13th century an empire so wealthy that a single journey made by its ruler in 1324 disrupted the gold markets of the entire Mediterranean world and caused an economic crisis in Egypt that lasted more than a decade. The ruler's name was Mansa Musa. The empire was called Mali. And Mansa Musa is, by the estimates of most economists who have attempted the calculation, the wealthiest individual human being who has ever lived. The Mali Empire grew from a small Mandinka kingdom in the 11th and 12th centuries into the dominant power of West Africa under a succession of capable rulers. By the time of Mansa Musa's reign in the early 14th century, the empire controlled the Western Sudan, the Great Belt of territory between the Sahara to the north and the Forest Belt to the south. It controlled the gold fields of Bambuk and Beret, which were among the most productive gold-producing regions in the ancient world. It controlled the salt trade from the great salt mines of Tagaza in the Sahara. It controlled the city of Timbuktu, which had grown from a seasonal camp into one of the great urban centers of the medieval world. Mansa Musa made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. This was in itself not unusual. Devout Muslim rulers undertook the Hajj as a religious obligation. What was unusual was the scale on which Mansa Musa undertook it. He traveled with a retinue of approximately 60,000 people. This included 12,000 personal slaves, each reportedly carrying 4 pounds of gold bars. 500 servants walked ahead of him. Each carried a gold staff weighing 500 mitkals, approximately 6 pounds. He brought 80 to 100 camels, each carrying between 300 and 350 pounds of gold dust. The total amount of gold he spent and distributed during the journey has been estimated at between 12 and 18 million modern-day troy ounces. At current prices, the gold he gave away on a single pilgrimage would be worth many billions of dollars. He gave it away freely. He distributed it to mosques, to the poor, to scholars, to rulers, to everyone he met. He spent it so lavishly in Cairo that the Egyptian gold market was so flooded with new supply that the value of gold in Egypt fell dramatically and did not recover for more than a decade. Contemporary Egyptian accounts describe merchants who had been wealthy their entire lives watching their fortunes shrink because a West African king had passed through and given everyone too much gold. The news of the journey spread across the Mediterranean world. European cartographers began placing Mali on their maps of Africa. A Catalan atlas produced in 1375, one of the most detailed maps of the known world from that period, shows a figure in the center of West Africa, seated on a throne, holding a gold scepter and a gold nugget, labeled Musameli. European traders began asking questions about the routes to the Gold Kingdom of the South. The knowledge that such wealth existed beyond the Sahara was one of the motivating factors behind the later Portuguese voyages of exploration down the African coast. The city of Timbuktu in Mansa Musa's time was not a remote and inaccessible place. It was a cosmopolitan center of learning, trade, and culture. The Sankor Mosque in Timbuktu housed a university, or a cluster of scholarly institutions that functioned as a university, with an enrollment at its peak of perhaps 25,000 students. The subjects taught included the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence, but also mathematics, astronomy, history, music, rhetoric, and medicine. The scholars of Timbuktu produced manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, on all of these subjects. The manuscripts were written on paper, bound in leather, stored in private libraries that were passed down through families like treasured inheritances. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are perhaps the most remarkable documentary legacy of medieval African scholarship. Estimates of the total number of manuscripts range widely, from 300,000 to over 1 million, held in private collections across Mali. Many have been studied. Many more have not. Some have been damaged by time and humidity and political instability. But a significant proportion survive, waiting in homes and in newly established archive institutions for the scholars who will eventually read all of them. Some of these manuscripts contain astronomical observations, mathematical theorems, and medical knowledge that, if they have not already been superseded by modern science, represent independent lines of intellectual development that the history of science has barely begun to incorporate. The Mali Empire declined in the 15th century, as internal conflicts and the rising power of the Songhai Empire to the east eroded its dominance. Timbuktu eventually fell under Songhai control, then under Moroccan control after 1591, then under a succession of other rulers. The great University of Sankore gradually ceased to function as a centralized institution. But the manuscripts remained. Quiet, patient, waiting in their leather bindings in family libraries across the city. The Songhai Empire and the scholars of Sankore. Stay in the valley of the Niger River for a little longer. Stay with the Great Bend, the wide, slow water, the city that once contained a library of the world. The Songhai Empire succeeded Mali as the dominant power of West Africa. At its greatest extent, under the rule of Askia Muhammad in the early 16th century, it covered an area of approximately 1.4 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Western Europe. It was one of the largest states in the world at the time. And it was, in many ways, the most thoroughly administered empire in African history, a complex federal system with appointed governors, a professional civil service, a standing army, and a standardized system of weights and measures for the gold and salt trade. Askia Muhammad came to power in 1493, just a year after Columbus's first voyage to the Americas, and ruled for 36 years. He was a deeply religious Muslim and a patron of learning on a scale that transformed Timbuktu into one of the most important intellectual centers in the world. He corresponded with scholars across the Islamic world. He invited learned men to his court and supported them. He himself made a pilgrimage to Mecca and returned with a commission as Caliph of the Western Sudan. The scholar most closely associated with the intellectual life of this period is Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr ibn Musa al-Wazani, known in European history as Leo Africanus. Born in Granada around 1494, he traveled extensively across North and West Africa and wrote a detailed description of the African continent that became one of the most important geographical and ethnographic texts of the 16th century. He visited Timbuktu around 1510 and described a city of great wealth and sophisticated culture, with a king who maintained extraordinary state, where books were more in demand and commanded higher prices than any other merchandise. This last detail, books more valuable than any other goods, is not a poetic flourish. It is an economic observation. The manuscript trade was a genuine commercial enterprise in Timbuktu. Scribes copied texts. Dealers bought and sold them. Scholars traveled long distances to acquire rare works. The book market of Timbuktu was a real market, in a city that took its intellectual commerce as seriously as its gold commerce. The scholars of Sankor, the broad network of teachers and students associated with the Mosque University complex, produced work in areas that might surprise anyone whose image of medieval African scholarship comes primarily from the absence of such scholarship in standard Western history courses. There were manuscripts on astronomy that tracked the movements of planets and stars with an accuracy derived from centuries of careful observation. There were manuscripts on mathematics that engaged with algebraic problems. There were manuscripts on medicine that described the treatment of specific diseases, the properties of specific plants, the management of specific surgical procedures. There were manuscripts on history, detailed chronicles of the kingdoms and rulers of the Western Sudan that provide historians with sources available nowhere else. There were manuscripts on music theory, on constitutional governance, on the proper conduct of trade. There were personal letters, business contracts, and court records. The full range of human intellectual life, documented in ink on paper, preserved in leather, in a city at the edge of the Sahara, for 500 years. The Songhai Empire was eventually destroyed by a Moroccan invasion in 1591. The Sultan of Morocco sent an army across the Sahara, an almost unprecedented military feat, equipped with firearms that the Songhai forces, who still relied on traditional weapons, could not counter. The Battle of Tondabai in March 1591 ended the Songhai Empire as a political entity. The scholars of Timbuktu were arrested by the Moroccan commanders, who feared their influence. Some were sent to Marrakesh. Others fled southward with their books. The great institutional structure of the Sankor University collapsed. But the books went with them. Into homes, into exile, into hiding. The manuscripts scattered across the Sahel, into private collections, into family libraries, into locked rooms in mud brick houses. They are still being found. They are still being catalogued. They are still being read, for the first time, by the first scholars to open them in centuries. The Swahili coast, where Africa met the world. Move to the east coast now. To the long warm coast of the Indian Ocean, where the land drops down from the interior plateau to the sea. Here, along a coastline stretching from what is now Somalia in the north to Mozambique in the south, a civilization grew over more than 1,000 years that was neither purely African nor purely Arabian but something new, something created by the meeting of the two. It was called the Swahili coast. And it was, for centuries, the eastern gateway through which Africa's interior wealth reached the wider world. The word Swahili comes from the Arabic Sahel, meaning coast. The people of the coast spoke Kiswahili, a language that is structurally Bantu, from the African interior, but which carries an enormous Arabic vocabulary, testament to centuries of close commercial and cultural contact. Today Kiswahili is spoken by between 50 and 200 million people across East Africa, making it one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. Every word of it carries the history of the coast in its roots. The Swahili city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Pate, Lamu, Zanzibar, Mozambique, were trading towns. Their wealth was built entirely on commerce, the exchange of goods from the African interior for goods from Arabia, India, Persia, and China. Gold and ivory and slaves moved east. porcelain and silk and glass beads and cotton cloth moved west. The dhow, the traditional sailing vessel of the Indian Ocean, moved between them, riding the monsoon winds that blow from the southwest in summer and from the northeast in winter, as reliably and predictably as a scheduled service. The monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean were the secret infrastructure of this trade. Their predictability meant that merchants could plan voyages years in advance with confidence. The outward journey on the southwest monsoon. The return journey on the northeast monsoon. A round trip of perhaps a year, carrying extraordinary profits. Arab and Persian and Indian merchants settled permanently on the Swahili coast. They married into local families. They built mosques. They brought their languages and their religions and their trade goods and wove them into the existing fabric of the coastal culture. The result was a civilization that was genuinely hybrid, not colonized, not conquered, but transformed by contact in the way that all great trading civilizations are transformed. The most powerful of the Swahili city-states in the medieval period was Kilwa, on an island off the coast of what is now Tanzania. At the height of its power in the 13th and 14th centuries, Kilwa controlled the gold trade from Great Zimbabwe to the north, effectively monopolizing the most important commodity in the Indian Ocean economy. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler who crossed most of the known world in the 14th century, visited Kilwa around 1330 and called it one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities in the world. He described a prosperous, well-governed town of handsome stone buildings, with a population that dressed elegantly and ate well and conducted business with an orderliness he found admirable. Archaeological excavations have confirmed his account in its essentials. The ruins of Kilwa include the remains of a great mosque, among the oldest mosques in sub-Saharan Africa, and a palace complex called Husuni Kubwa, which was one of the largest single buildings in medieval sub-Saharan Africa. Chinese porcelain found at Kilwa and at dozens of other Swahili coast sites speaks to the reach of this trading world. Chinese records from the Ming Dynasty describe diplomatic and commercial contacts with the East African coast. A famous voyage by the Chinese Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century reached the East African coast and returned to China with, among other things, a giraffe, which was presented to the emperor as a qilin, a mythical good luck creature of Chinese tradition, and received with ceremonial enthusiasm at court. The giraffe's calm bewilderment in the emperor's gardens. The emperor's delight at receiving it. The thousands of kilometers of sea voyage that lay between them and the East African grasslands where it had once run freely. These details are preserved in Chinese court records. They are small, precise, human moments in the very long story of the world's oldest trading network. The Kingdom of Benin, Masters in Bronze. Travel now to the forest belt of West Africa. To the humid, dense, extraordinary environment of what is now southern Nigeria, where the light through the canopy falls in columns, where the air is warm and heavy with moisture, and where, beginning around the 13th century CE, an artistic tradition arose that produced work of such technical mastery and emotional power that its rediscovery by Europeans in the late 19th century caused a genuine crisis in the received understanding of African civilization. The Kingdom of Benin, not to be confused with the modern Republic of Benin to the west, was centered on the city of Benin City in what is now Edo State, Nigeria. Its ruler was called the Oba. The Oba was both a political and a sacred figure, the descendant of the founder of the dynasty, himself believed to be semi-divine. The royal palace of the Oba at Benin City was a complex of extraordinary scale and sophistication. 16th-century Dutch accounts describe a palace as large as the city of Haarlem, with wide streets, fine houses, and a general orderliness that the European visitors found impressive and unexpected. The Oba moved through his city under ceremonial protocols of extraordinary complexity. The approach to his throne room was governed by rules so elaborate that they constituted a kind of architecture of social space, each position, each gesture, each moment of approach or withdrawal precisely defined. The art of Benin. This is where history sits up and pays attention. The bronze casters of Benin, members of a hereditary guild called the Eigen Iranwan, produced works of cast brass and bronze that rank among the finest metal sculpture ever made by human hands. The Benin bronzes, portrait heads of Obas and Queen Mothers, narrative plaques depicting court life and historical events, figures of warriors and animals and royal attendants, were produced over a period of several centuries using the lost wax casting technique. The technical skill required to produce them is extraordinary. The detail of court dress, of facial expression, of physical gesture, preserved in metal with a clarity that centuries have not dimmed. The quiet authority in the face of a cast Oba portrait. The exact rendering of a warrior's body, the position of his hands, the weight of his weapons. When British forces arrived at Benin City in 1897 as part of a punitive expedition following the killing of a British diplomatic party, they found the palace filled with these bronzes. The palace was burned. Approximately 3,000 to 5,000 objects were removed: bronzes, ivory carvings, wooden figures, royal regalia. They were shipped to Britain and distributed among museums, private collectors, and the soldiers who had carried them away. They ended up across the world, in the British Museum, in Berlin's Ethnologists Museum, in Vienna, in Paris, in Chicago, in dozens of other institutions. When these objects first appeared in European museums in the late 1890s, the reaction from scholars and critics was almost uniformly one of astonishment. How, they asked, was it possible that objects of such obvious technical and artistic sophistication had come from the people Europeans had been confidently describing as primitive for the better part of a century? Some scholars initially refused to accept that they were genuinely African. They proposed that they had been made by Portuguese craftsmen, or that Benin had learned bronze casting from European visitors. The historical and archaeological evidence quickly demolished these theories. The bronze casting tradition at Benin predates European contact by centuries. But the initial refusal to believe speaks to something real about how deeply the denial of African sophistication had been embedded in European consciousness. The debate about the repatriation of the Benin bronzes continues today. Nigeria has formally requested the return of its cultural heritage. Some institutions have returned pieces. Others have not. The bronzes are still scattered across the world, in climate-controlled storage and public galleries and private collections, separated from the palaces and shrines and ceremonial contexts for which they were made. But they still speak. The face of the Oba, cast in metal 600 years ago. The quiet authority. The extraordinary precision. Still there. still speaking, in the language of objects, about the civilization that made them. The science of ancient Africa, stars, numbers, and medicine. Let us slow down now. Let the names of empires and the distances of trade routes recede for a moment. And let us think about something quieter. Something that happens in the mind before it happens anywhere else. Mathematics. The oldest known mathematical artifact in the world was found in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is called the Ishango bone. It is a small piece of baboon fibula, approximately 10 centimeters long, with a series of carved notches arranged in groups along its length. It was found in 1950 at Ishango, on the shores of Lake Edward, in a layer of sediment dated to approximately 25,000 years ago. The notches on the Ishango bone are not random. They are arranged in patterns that scholars have interpreted as evidence of deliberate mathematical activity, possibly a counting system, possibly a lunar calendar, possibly a record of arithmetic operations. The exact interpretation is still debated. But the debate itself is instructive. 25,000 years ago, a human being in Central Africa was making marks on a bone in a pattern that carries mathematical structure. The impulse to count, to record, to find pattern in number, this impulse is as old as modern human cognition, and its oldest surviving physical record comes from the heart of Africa. The ancient Egyptians, who were, as we have noted, Africans, developed one of the most sophisticated mathematical traditions of the ancient world. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, written around 1650 BCE, is a manual of practical mathematics containing 84 problems. The problems deal with fractions, geometry, volumes, and areas. The solutions demonstrate a thorough command of practical arithmetic and algebra that was, in its time, as sophisticated as anything being produced anywhere else in the world. The calculation of the area of a circle in the Rhind papyrus gives a value for pi of approximately 3.16, an approximation accurate to within 1% of the true value, achieved more than 3,500 years ago. The astronomical knowledge of ancient Africa runs as deep. The alignment of the Nubian monument known as Nabta Playa, a circle of standing stones in the Egyptian Sahara, suggests that it functioned as a calendar, aligning with the summer solstice and perhaps with certain stars. It was constructed approximately 7,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known astronomical monuments in the world, predating Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years. The Dogon people of Mali have attracted attention from Western scholars since the 1930s because of astronomical knowledge contained in their traditional religion that seems to describe the binary nature of the star Sirius, the existence of a small, dense companion star that is invisible to the naked eye, centuries or millennia before its official discovery by Western astronomy in the 19th century. The debate about how the Dogon possessed this knowledge, and whether the Western scholars who documented it fully understood what they were being told, is complex and ongoing. But the question itself, how ancient astronomical observation in Africa relates to what Western science has formally documented, is a genuinely interesting one that is still being actively explored. Traditional African medicine is another domain in which the depth of accumulated knowledge is only beginning to be adequately studied by modern science. For centuries, Western medicine largely dismissed traditional African medical practice as superstition. More recent pharmacological research has confirmed that a significant proportion of the plants used in traditional African healing contain compounds with genuine physiological effects: antibacterial, antimalarial, anti-inflammatory, analgesic. The knowledge of which plants, in which preparations, for which conditions, accumulated over generations of careful observation and transmitted through oral tradition and written manuscripts, represents a pharmacological database of extraordinary depth. Several modern pharmaceuticals have been derived from or inspired by compounds first identified in traditional African medicine. The full pharmaceutical potential of the African plant pharmacopoeia has not yet been systematically studied. The work is ongoing. The plants are still there. The knowledge is still there, in the people who carry it and the manuscripts that preserve it. The Iron Age of Africa: how a continent fed itself. There is a quieter kind of history than the history of empires. It is the history of ordinary life, of tools and crops and the slow, patient work of feeding and sheltering a human community through the years. Let us drift into that kind of history now. The kind that requires no battles, no famous names. Only the sound of hammering metal and the smell of turned earth. Iron smelting was developed independently in sub-Saharan Africa sometime around the middle of the first millennium BCE. For a long time, Western scholars assumed that iron technology had spread to Africa from the Middle East or from North Africa. Archaeological evidence accumulated over the past several decades has challenged this assumption substantially. Sites in Tanzania and Rwanda and Nigeria have produced evidence of iron smelting that predates or contemporizes with the earliest iron production in many other parts of the world. The possibility that iron technology was independently invented in sub-Saharan Africa, possibly more than once, in different regions, is now considered seriously by the specialist community. The iron smelters of the Great Lakes region of East Africa developed furnace designs that were, in certain technical respects, more sophisticated than those used in Europe at the same period. The preheated air blast furnace, a technique that increases the temperature of the smelt by preheating the air used to drive the fire, was used in the Great Lakes region of Africa at least as early as the 1st century CE. This technique was not used in European iron production until the 19th century Industrial Revolution. The African smiths who developed it did so through empirical observation, through watching what worked and refining it across generations. The knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, through the close relationship between a master smith and the young person who watched his hands and listened to his explanations and eventually took over the work. Iron changed everything. Iron axes cleared forest for farmland. Iron hoes broke hard soil for cultivation. Iron weapons changed the military balance between communities. Iron tools enabled craft specialization: the smith, the carpenter, the builder, that is the foundation of any complex social organization. The spread of Bantu-speaking peoples across sub-Saharan Africa, one of the largest and most consequential demographic movements in human prehistory, was associated with the spread of iron technology and of the agricultural practices that iron tools made possible. Beginning around 3,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking communities expanded from what is now southeastern Nigeria and Cameroon southward and eastward, across the forests and savannas and highlands of central, eastern, and southern Africa. They brought with them their languages, their cattle, their crops, sorghum, millet, yams, and their knowledge of working metal. They did not displace the people they encountered so much as intermix with them, adopt their knowledge of the local environment, and gradually integrate the existing populations into an expanding network of related cultures. The result is the enormous and varied tapestry of Bantu-related cultures that covers most of sub-Saharan Africa today. More than 400 million people speaking languages that share a common ancestor spoken in a small region of West Africa 3,000 years ago. One of the most successful and far-reaching cultural expansions in human history. Accomplished by farmers and herders and iron workers. Not by conquest, but by movement. The Kingdom of Dahomey and the Women Warriors. There is a story that belongs here. A quieter story, but one that carries a particular kind of weight. In the Kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now the Republic of Benin in West Africa, there existed, from approximately the 17th century onward, a corps of female soldiers who served as the royal bodyguard and as an elite fighting force within the Dahamean army. They were called, in the Fon language, Agoji. European visitors to the kingdom called them Dahomey Amazons. They are now sometimes referred to simply as the Mino, meaning our mothers. The Agoji were not symbolic. They were not ceremonial guards who carried weapons they were never expected to use. They were trained soldiers, drilled in military discipline and fighting techniques, who participated in the military campaigns of the Dahamean kingdom in the 18th and 19th centuries. European accounts from the period, by French military officers who encountered them in the late 19th century colonial conflicts, described them as exceptionally brave, well-disciplined, and militarily effective. French officers who had fought in multiple conflicts recorded their shock at the tactical sophistication of the Agoji formations. The origins of the Agoji are somewhat debated. One tradition holds that they grew from a corps of royal elephant hunters called the Beto. Another holds that they began as the king's bodyguard and expanded into a military force over time. What is clear is that by the late 18th century, the Agoji were an established and significant institution within the Dahamean military, with their own ranks, their own ceremonies, their own songs, and their own distinct identity within the kingdom. At the height of the Agoji institution, estimates of their number range from 1,000 to 6,000, a substantial proportion of the total Dahamean military force. They were celibate by regulation during their service. They were considered wives of the king, and consequently untouchable by other men. They lived in the royal palace compound. They trained constantly. And they were among the last defenders of Dahomey when the French colonial forces arrived in the 1890s. The last known surviving member of the Agoji was a woman named Nawi, who died in 1979 at the claimed age of approximately 100 years. She was interviewed by researchers in the final years of her life. She remembered. She described. And through her memory, a living connection was maintained between the present and the extraordinary institution she had been part of. A thread of memory, thin and fragile, but real. Ancient African astronomy and the night sky. The night sky over Africa. Because the continent spans both hemispheres, because it extends from the Mediterranean coast in the north to the Cape of Good Hope in the south, Africa contains within its landscapes both the northern and southern hemispheres of the night sky. The stars visible from the southern tip of the continent are different from the stars visible from the northern coast. The Milky Way, seen from the interior of the continent on a clear night far from artificial light, stretches across the sky with a density and brightness that most people who live in cities have never experienced. Human beings in Africa have been looking at this sky for longer than anywhere else on Earth. The relationship between people and the night sky in Africa is older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than settled life. It goes back to the earliest period of anatomically modern humans, when the sky was the only clock, the only calendar, the only map. In southern Africa, the San people, one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, whose ancestors have lived in the region for at least 100,000 years, have a rich tradition of astronomical knowledge woven into their oral literature and ritual practice. The Pleiades, the star cluster known in European tradition as the Seven Sisters, are recognized by many San communities as a group of stars associated with the coming of rain and the beginning of the agricultural season. Their appearance in the morning sky signals the time for planting. Their position in the night sky tells the careful observer where in the year she stands. This is not primitive astronomy. This is sophisticated, practical, precise astronomical knowledge, transmitted across generations with the care that any culture takes with knowledge that keeps it alive. The Egyptian astronomical tradition, which is one of the most extensively documented astronomical traditions of the ancient world, included star charts that mapped the northern sky, tables of the heliacal rising of stars that were used to track the calendar, and a division of the night into 12 equal hours based on the rising of groups of stars called decans. The Egyptian star clock tradition fed into the Hellenistic astronomical tradition, which fed into the medieval astronomical tradition, which fed into the scientific revolution. The line of descent from an Egyptian astronomer watching the sky from a rooftop in the Nile Valley to a modern astronomer calibrating a satellite is long and indirect and passes through many cultures. But it is real. It exists. The thread is there. And somewhere in that long inheritance, at the very beginning of it, there are human eyes looking up at the same stars you might look at tonight if you were to step outside and let your eyes adjust to the dark. The same stars. The same sky. Watched for longer than you can easily imagine. Drifting through the long history. Let your thoughts loosen now. Let them drift the way water drifts downstream. Not directed. Not held to any particular course. Just moving, slowly, through the things we have touched tonight. The pyramids of Sudan, steeper than the Egyptian ones, rising from desert sand. More than 250 of them, scattered across a landscape that most of the world has never seen. The obelisks of Aksum, carved from single pieces of granite, raised by hands without cranes, still standing in the high plateau of Ethiopia. The walls of Great Zimbabwe, fitted without mortar, still standing without mortar, still speaking quietly about the intelligence that placed each stone against the next. The manuscripts of Timbuktu. Hundreds of thousands of them. In leather bindings. In family libraries. In the homes of people whose grandparents kept them through times of great danger and did not let them go. The gold of Mansa Musa, so abundant that it disrupted the economy of another continent. The libraries of Sankor, where students came from across the Islamic world to learn mathematics and medicine and law. The dhows of the Swahili coast, sailing on the monsoon winds to India and Persia and China, carrying gold and ivory and returning with porcelain and cloth. The bronze faces of the Benin obus, cast with such precision that their expressions survived 600 years and still carry the quiet authority of the living people they portray. The iron furnaces of the Great Lakes, producing metal at temperatures that European technology would not match for another 1,000 years. The Agoji soldiers of Dahomey, drilling in the royal compound, carrying weapons they were fully trained and fully prepared to use. The Ishango bone, 25,000 years old. Its notches still in the positions where unknown hands placed them. The oldest mathematics we have, found in the heart of Africa. All of this is part of human history. All of it. Not African history as a separate subject. Not African history as a supplement to the history that really matters. Human history. The only history there is. The story of all of us, beginning in the same place. Moving outward across the earth in every direction. Building cities and empires and libraries and cathedrals and pyramids and stone walls and bronze sculptures and sailing ships and astronomical monuments. Writing things down and keeping them. Watching the sky. Teaching the children. Making something that would last. This is what human beings do. Wherever they are. Wherever they have been. And tonight, some small part of what was forgotten has found its way back to you. In the dark. In the quiet. In the slow drift before sleep. The world is very old. Older than any empire. Older than any writing. Older than any name we have given to anything. And tonight, across the world, in every time zone, in every climate, in cities and villages and places without names, people are lying down and letting the day go. They are letting their thoughts slow. They are letting their bodies become heavy. They are letting the darkness be enough. You are doing that now. There is nothing that needs your attention. Nothing that requires a decision. Nothing that is pressing enough to be pressed against the quiet of this moment. The pyramids of Meroe are still standing. They will be standing tomorrow. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are still in their bindings. They will be there tomorrow. The walls of Great Zimbabwe are still fitted together without mortar. They will be fitted together tomorrow. Everything that was built with patience is still there. Everything that was kept with care is still kept. Everything that was made to last has lasted. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the distance grow between one thought and the next. Let the names drift away. Aksum, Kush, Mali, Zimbabwe, Carthage, Benin. Beautiful names, carrying beautiful things inside them. Let them go gently. They will still be there when you wake. The sky over Africa is very dark tonight. The stars are very bright. The Milky Way stretches from horizon to horizon. The same stars, the same sky, watched for 100,000 years. You are part of that watching. Whether you look or not, whether you remember or not, The thread is long, and you are somewhere in it, resting. In the dark, in the quiet, in the deep and ancient night. Sleep.